the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. My hands trembled as I picked up the bottle, the plastic warm from Victoria's body heat. The prescription date was 3 days ago, but the bottle was already half empty. The patient name read Margaret Chen, an elderly woman I knew Victoria had mentioned losing to cancer 2 months prior. Dead patients don't need pain medication, yet here was proof my sister was still prescribing in their names, feeding an addiction that had been slowly destroying everything in its path, including my relationship with David. The sound of Victoria's heels clicking against the hardwood floors of her penthouse apartment grew closer. I shoved the bottle into my jacket pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Through the bathroom's frosted glass window, I could see the Seattle skyline stretching endlessly, the Space Needle piercing the gray October morning like a needle through fabric. How fitting that I'd discovered my sister's secret in a city built on elevation and ambition, where the higher you climbed, the farther you had to fall. Elena, are you feeling better? Victoria's voice carried that perfect blend of professional concern and sisterly warmth that had fooled everyone, including me, for months. She'd been a pediatric surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital for 8 years, respected by colleagues, beloved by patients' families, and trusted with the most delicate lives imaginable. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who spent her days healing children was simultaneously destroying the people closest to her. I splashed cold water on my face, buying time to compose myself. The woman staring back at me in Victoria's pristine mirror looked older than her 28 years. Dark circles shadowed my brown eyes, and my usually vibrant black hair hung limp around my shoulders. Teaching high school English had always been demanding, but these past 6 months had aged me in ways that went beyond simple exhaustion. Every argument with David, every mysterious phone call Victoria made during family dinners, every lie I'd started to suspect but couldn't prove, it had all been wearing me down like water over stone. The bottle in my pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, dense with implications and consequences I wasn't sure I was ready to face. This wasn't just about pills or addiction or even medical fraud. This was about the systematic destruction of trust. The way Victoria had weaponized her position as both my older sister and David's doctor to drive a wedge between us that had grown wider with each passing week. "I'm fine," I called back, forcing steadiness into my voice. But I wasn't fine, and I hadn't been since David started seeing Victoria as his physician 3 months ago. It had seemed natural at the time. He needed a new doctor after his previous one retired, and Victoria had offered to help. "Family should take care of family," she had said, with that radiant smile that had charmed everyone, from our parents to hospital administrators, to the medical board that had fast-tracked her through every promotion. What I hadn't realized was that Victoria's definition of taking care had evolved into something twisted and manipulative. The first sign was subtle. David mentioning that Victoria had suggested he might be working too hard, that the stress of his architecture firm was affecting his health more than he realized. Then came the medications, mild anxiolytics at first, prescribed for what Victoria diagnosed as generalized anxiety disorder. He'd been reluctant, but Victoria was persuasive. "Your sister knows what she's talking about," he told me. "She's seen what untreated anxiety can do." The medications had changed him. Not dramatically at first, but in small ways that accumulated like interest. He became more withdrawn, less interested in the hiking trips we'd always shared, more dependent on Victoria's medical opinions for decisions that had never required a doctor's input before. When I expressed concern, Victoria had professional explanations ready, adjustment periods, necessary dosage modifications, the complex nature of mental health treatment. But I'd started noticing other things. The way Victoria's pupils sometimes seemed too small during family dinners, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking, the defensive way she responded to any casual mention of work stress or patient loads.
and most tellingly, the way she'd begun inserting herself into my relationship with David with increasing frequency, always under the guise of medical necessity. David mentioned he's been having trouble sleeping again, she'd say during our weekly coffee dates. I think we need to adjust his medication. Could you ask him to come in this week? Or, I'm concerned about David's alcohol consumption. Has he been drinking more lately? It could interact with his anxiety medication in dangerous ways. Each conversation was a masterpiece of manipulation, designed to make me doubt David's honesty, his mental state, his commitment to our relationship. Victoria presented herself as the concerned professional, caught between her medical ethics and her love for both of us. But I was beginning to see the puppet strings she'd been pulling all along. The real breakthrough had come 2 weeks ago during David's birthday dinner. Victoria had insisted on hosting, had chosen the restaurant, had even ordered David's meal for him when he'd hesitated over the menu. You know how decision-making can be difficult when you're managing anxiety, she'd explained to the table, her voice carrying just enough authority to make everyone nod in agreement. But I'd caught David's expression in that moment, a flash of confusion and embarrassment that suggested this was the first time he'd heard that particular symptom attributed to his condition. That's when I'd started researching anxiety disorders, medication side effects, and the ethics of treating family members. What I'd found had filled me with a cold dread that had been growing stronger each day. Now, standing in Victoria's bathroom with stolen evidence burning a hole in my pocket, I finally understood the scope of what she'd been doing. This wasn't just about controlling David or sabotaging our relationship. This was about feeding an addiction that required increasingly desperate measures to sustain. Dead patients' prescriptions were just the beginning. I was certain that if I dug deeper, I'd find a web of fraud and manipulation that extended far beyond the pills in my pocket. The sound of Victoria ending her phone call drifted through the apartment, followed by the soft thud of her setting down her phone. "Elena, I'm making coffee. Do you want some?" I stepped out of the bathroom, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. Victoria stood in her gleaming kitchen, every surface reflecting the LED lighting she'd installed when she'd bought this place last year. Even in casual clothes, expensive yoga pants, and a cashmere sweater, she looked like she belonged in a medical journal advertisement. Successful, confident, caring, the perfect doctor, the perfect sister, the perfect lie. "Coffee sounds good," I managed, settling onto one of her bar stools. The marble countertop was cold beneath my forearms, and I found myself studying the veins in the stone, looking for patterns in the chaos. Victoria moved with practiced efficiency, her movements almost ritualistic as she prepared our drinks. I watched her carefully now, seeing things I'd missed before. The way she opened the cabinet where she kept her coffee supplies, but not before glancing toward a different cabinet first, one that she quickly looked away from. The slight pause before she reached for mugs, as if she was fighting some internal urge. The way her hand shook almost imperceptibly as she poured the coffee, though she studied it quickly. "You seem tense," she observed, settling across from me with her own mug. Steam rose between us like a barrier, and I found myself thinking about all the conversations we'd had across this counter, all the advice she'd given me about David, about life, about trust. How much of it had been lies designed to serve her own purposes?
"Just tired," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. "Work's been stressful." Victoria nodded knowingly. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation last week. About David. Have you noticed any changes in his behavior lately?" Here it was again, the careful probing disguised as concern. I felt the prescription bottle in my pocket like a weight, like a weapon I wasn't sure how to use. "What kind of changes?" "Well, when he came in for his appointment on Tuesday, he seemed agitated, more than usual. I'm wondering if we need to reassess his medication regimen." Victoria's voice carried that perfect note of professional concern, but now I could hear the calculated nature of it, the way she was steering the conversation toward predetermined conclusions. "He seemed fine when he got home," I lied, because David had actually seemed distant and confused after that appointment, though he dismissed my questions about it. Victoria's smile tightened slightly. Sometimes patients don't want to worry their loved ones. They'll put on a brave face at home while struggling internally. It's one of the challenges of treating people close to us. They feel like they need to protect us from their problems. The irony was breathtaking. Victoria was describing her own behavior perfectly while projecting it onto David. I took a sip of coffee to buy myself time to think, the bitter liquid burning my tongue. What are you suggesting? I think we might need to consider increasing his dosage, or possibly adding something for the agitation. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. I know it's difficult to see someone you love struggling, Elena, but sometimes the kindest thing we can do is acknowledge that they need more help than they're asking for. The prescription bottle seemed to pulse in my pocket like a second heartbeat. I thought about Margaret Chen, the elderly cancer patient who had died 2 months ago, but was apparently still receiving pain medication. I thought about David's increasing confusion about his own symptoms, the way he'd started deferring to Victoria's judgment, even in matters that had nothing to do with his health. I thought about all the ways trust could be weaponized, all the ways love could be twisted into something that served the person claiming to offer it. I need to ask you something, I said quietly, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. Victoria raised an eyebrow, her coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. Of course. What is it? Are you okay? Really okay? I've been worried about you lately. The change in Victoria's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The practiced warmth flickered for just a moment, replaced by something sharp and defensive before she managed to smooth it away. That's sweet of you to ask, but I'm fine. Why do you ask? You've seemed different, stressed, and I know how demanding your job is, how much pressure you're under. I was walking a tightrope now, trying to probe without revealing what I'd discovered. Sometimes I wonder if you're taking care of yourself the way you take care of everyone else. Victoria's laugh was light and dismissive, but I caught the slight delay before it came, the way she had to reach for it. You sound like Mom. I'm fine, Elena. Really. Yes, work is stressful, but that's nothing new. I've been doing this for 8 years. I know how to manage the pressure. But even as she spoke, I noticed the way her free hand moved almost unconsciously toward her purse, which sat on the counter beside her, the same purse the prescription bottle had fallen from. The gesture was subtle, protective, like she was reassuring herself that something important was still there. I just want to make sure you have support, I pressed. Sometimes the people who spend their lives taking care of others forget that they need care too.
I appreciate your concern, Victoria said, and now there was a slight edge to her voice. But I think you might be projecting your anxiety about David onto me. It's natural when someone we love is struggling with mental health issues, it can make us hyper-vigilant about everyone else's well-being. There it was, the deflection, the way she turned my concern back into evidence of David's supposed problems. It was masterfully done, so smooth that if I hadn't been looking for it, I might have accepted her explanation. Instead, it confirmed what I was beginning to understand about my sister. Every conversation was a chess game, and she was always thinking several moves ahead. I finished my coffee in silence, my mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The prescription bottle in my pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric, demanding action I wasn't sure I was prepared to take. Because exposing Victoria wouldn't just mean confronting her addiction or her fraud. It would mean destroying the image everyone had of her, including our parents. It would mean acknowledging that the person I'd looked up to my entire life, the sister I'd trusted with my deepest secrets and biggest fears, had been systematically manipulating me and the man I loved. But it would also mean saving David from whatever Victoria was doing to him and preventing her from harming the patients who trusted her with their lives. I should go, I said, standing and carrying my mug to the sink. Thanks for the coffee. Of course. Victoria rose as well, moving to walk me to the door. Elena, about David, I really think we should schedule another appointment this week. The sooner we address these issues, the better. I turned to look at her, this woman who shared my genes and my childhood memories, but had somehow become a stranger. She looked so sincere, so genuinely concerned, that for a moment I almost doubted what I'd discovered. Almost. "I'll talk to him," I said. But as I walked toward the elevator, Victoria's words echoing behind me, I knew I wouldn't be talking to David about another appointment. Instead, I would be researching medical board complaint procedures, prescription fraud penalties, and the ethics of treating family members. The elevator doors closed on Victoria's perfect apartment, her perfect facade, her perfectly constructed lies. As I descended toward the parking garage, I pulled out my phone and opened a new note. At the top, I typed, "Evidence against Dr. Victoria Reyes." Below that, I began documenting everything I could remember: dates, conversations, inconsistencies, observations. The prescription bottles shifted in my pocket as the elevator came to a stop, reminding me that this was no longer about suspicion or doubt. It was about proof, consequences, and the kind of choice that would change everything for both of us. I had evidence now. The question was whether I had the courage to use it. The drive home from Victoria's apartment took me through the heart of Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, past coffee shops where I'd spent countless hours grading papers, and couples walking dogs in the October drizzle. Normal life continuing around me while my world tilted on its axis. I pulled into the parking space behind our apartment building, the modest two-bedroom David and I had shared for 3 years, and sat in the car for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, prescription bottle heavy in my pocket. Our apartment building was a converted Victorian house, painted sage green with white trim, divided into 4 units. It wasn't glamorous like Victoria's penthouse, but it had character. Creaky floors that announced your arrival, windows that stuck in the rain, and a shared garden where Mrs. Chen from the first floor grew tomatoes that she distributed to all the tenants in August. It was home, in a way Victoria's sterile perfection could never be. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell. The hallway smelled like coffee, and the lavender sachets Mrs. Patterson from 2B kept in a bowl by her door. These were the small comforts I'd built my life around. Predictable rhythms, modest pleasures, relationships based on genuine affection rather than manipulation or control. David was at his drafting table when I entered, architectural plans spread before him like he was conducting an orchestra of lines and measurements. His dark hair was mussed from running his fingers through it, a habit he'd developed when concentrating. The afternoon light from our west-facing window caught the silver threads that had appeared at his temples over the past year, not from age, but from the stress of starting his own firm. "How's Victoria?" he asked without looking up, his voice carrying that careful neutrality that had become his default when discussing my sister. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door, hyper-aware of the prescription bottle's weight. "She's fine. Made coffee, we talked." The lies came easily, a skill I had apparently inherited from my family. David nodded absently, making a note on his plans. I watched him work, noting the slight tremor in his hand that I'd started attributing to too much caffeine, but now suspected might be medication-related. He'd been taking the pills Victoria prescribed for 3 months now, and the changes had been gradual enough that I'd dismissed them as stress from work or the natural evolution of our relationship. But now I saw them differently. The way he second-guessed decisions that had never troubled him before, the increasing dependency on Victoria's medical opinions, the way he'd started apologizing for things that weren't his fault, as if he'd internalized the idea that his anxiety made him a burden. "I've been thinking about what Victoria said last week," David continued, still focused on his work, "about maybe taking some time off, reducing my stress levels." "What did she say exactly?" I settled onto the couch, close enough to observe him, but not so close that he'd feel interrogated. David finally looked up, his green eyes meeting mine with an expression I couldn't quite read. Just that she's concerned about how the business stress is affecting my mental health. She thinks I might be pushing myself too hard, not acknowledging how much the anxiety is impacting my daily life. The clinical language, "impacting my daily life," sounded foreign in David's mouth. He was a practical man who fixed problems with his hands and solved challenges through design. This clinical vocabulary wasn't his, it was Victoria's, filtering through him like a ventriloquist's voice. "How do you feel about that?" I asked, borrowing the therapist's trick of turning questions back to the speaker. David set down his pencil and rubbed his temples. "I don't know anymore. Sometimes I feel fine, like myself. But then Victoria points out behaviors I hadn't noticed, symptoms that apparently indicate my anxiety is worse than I realized. It's confusing." "What kind of behaviors?" "Little things, the way I organize my tools or how I double-check measurements. She says it might be manifestations of obsessive-compulsive tendencies related to the anxiety disorder." David's voice carried doubt, as if he was testing the words to see how they felt. I never thought of myself as obsessive, but maybe I just wasn't aware of it. I felt something cold settle in my chest. David's attention to detail had always been one of his strengths as an architect. His careful measurements and organized tools weren't symptoms of a disorder. They were professional habits that had made him successful. But Victoria was reframing his competence as pathology, his strengths as weaknesses that required medical intervention. "Do you feel obsessive?"
I'm not sure. Victoria says that's part of the problem. Patients often don't recognize their own symptoms. She says I might be so used to managing the anxiety that I don't realize how much energy it's costing me. David picked up his pencil again, then set it down. Maybe that's why I've been so tired lately. Why I haven't felt like going hiking or other things. The other things hung between us like a shadow. Our physical relationship had been affected too, though we'd both been too polite to address it directly. I'd attributed it to work stress and the natural ebb and flow of long-term relationships. Now I wondered if it was a side effect of whatever Victoria was giving him. "What if we got a second opinion?" I suggested carefully, just to make sure the medication is working as well as it could be. David's reaction was immediate and telling. His whole body tensed, and he looked at me with something close to alarm. "I can't do that to Victoria. She's been so generous with her time, seeing me even though I'm not technically her patient. It would be insulting to suggest her treatment isn't working." "You're not technically her patient?" "Well, I mean, she's treating me as a favor, because of you, because we're family." David's voice carried a note of guilt, as if he'd been taking advantage of Victoria's generosity, rather than being manipulated by it. She could get in trouble for treating a family member's boyfriend. She's taking a professional risk to help me. This was new information, and it hit me like a physical blow. Victoria had been treating David outside the normal patient-doctor relationship, which meant there were no official records, no oversight, no standard protections. She'd created a situation where her medical decisions were essentially invisible to regulatory bodies, while simultaneously making David feel indebted to her. I thought about the prescription bottle in my jacket pocket, about Margaret Chen's name on a label for someone who had died 2 months ago. How many other unofficial patients was Victoria treating? How many people was she manipulating under the guise of providing medical care? "Elena?" David's voice brought me back to the present. "What look?" "Like you're trying to solve a puzzle. Like when you're grading essays and you find one that doesn't make sense." David attempted a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Victoria mentioned that you might be overthinking things lately. She said anxiety can be contagious in relationships, that watching someone you love struggle with mental health can make you hypervigilant about everything." There it was again, Victoria's voice coming through David, her interpretations becoming his reality. She wasn't just treating him, she was treating our relationship, diagnosing problems that didn't exist and prescribing solutions that served her agenda. "I'm going to make dinner," I said, needing movement to process what I was learning. "Are you hungry?" "Not really. The medication affects my appetite sometimes." David returned to his plans, dismissing his lack of hunger as if it were as natural as the rain outside. I moved to the kitchen, our small galley space separated from the living room by a breakfast bar. As I pulled vegetables from the refrigerator, I tried to catalog all the changes I'd attributed to work stress, relationship evolution, or simple life circumstances. David's decreased appetite, his reduced interest in activities he'd always enjoyed, the way he'd started deferring to Victoria's judgment on things unrelated to his health, his increasing self-doubt about decisions he'd always made confidently.
Viewed individually, each change could have a dozen explanations. Viewed together, they painted a picture of someone being systematically undermined, his sense of self eroded by an authority figure he trusted completely. I chopped carrots with more force than necessary, the knife hitting the cutting board with sharp, rhythmic strikes. The prescription bottle felt like it was radiating heat from my jacket, demanding attention, demanding action. But what kind of action? Report Victoria to the medical board based on a single prescription bottle and a growing list of suspicions? Confront her directly and risk her destroying evidence or escalating whatever she was doing to David? Try to convince David that the sister he'd come to see as his savior was actually the source of his problems? The sound of David's pencil tapping against his drafting table provided a nervous counterpoint to my chopping. When I glanced over, I saw him staring at his plans with an expression of frustration I'd seen increasingly often in recent weeks. He'd pick up his pencil, start to make a mark, then pause, as if second-guessing himself. The confident architect I'd fallen in love with was disappearing, replaced by someone who questioned every decision and sought reassurance for choices he'd once made instinctively. "This isn't working," David muttered, pushing back from the table. "What's not working?" "These plans. I keep second-guessing every line, every measurement. Victoria's right. The anxiety is affecting my work." David stood and walked to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Maybe I should take that time off," she suggested. "Clear my head, get the medication balanced properly." The idea of David taking time off at Victoria's suggestion filled me with alarm. Time away from work would mean more isolation, more dependence on Victoria's guidance, fewer external perspectives to counteract her influence. She was systematically removing David from situations where he might encounter viewpoints that contradicted hers. "What would you do with time off?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Victoria suggested I might benefit from a more structured approach to managing stress, maybe some kind of intensive therapy program. She knows of some residential facilities that specialize in anxiety disorders, places where you can really focus on healing without the distractions of daily life. Residential facilities. Victoria wanted to remove David not just from work, but from our home, our relationship, our shared life. She wanted complete control over his environment, his influences, his reality. The knife slipped in my hand, nicking my finger. Blood welled up immediately, bright red against my skin. I rushed to the sink, running cold water over the cut, while my mind raced through implications and possibilities. "Are you okay?" David was beside me immediately, his concern overriding his own troubles. "Just a cut. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. None of this was fine. David found bandages in the bathroom while I applied pressure to the cut. When he returned, his movements were gentle and practiced as he cleaned and bandaged my finger. For a moment, he was completely present. No second-guessing, no anxiety about his competence, just the natural care he'd always shown me. "There," he said, smoothing the bandage. "Good as new." "Thank you." I caught his hand in mine, studying his face in the kitchen light. This was the David I'd fallen in love with. Competent, caring, present. Not the uncertain, anxious version that Victoria's treatment was creating. "David, how do you feel right now?" In this moment, I mean.
He considered the question seriously. Fine. Calm, actually. Focused. Then his expression shifted, becoming guarded. But Victoria says that's misleading. She says anxiety can create periods of false calm that make patients think they don't need treatment. That's why it's important to trust medical expertise rather than subjective feelings. Even his self-awareness was being turned against him. Victoria had created a perfect trap. When David felt good, it was evidence that he wasn't recognizing his symptoms. When he felt bad, it was proof that he needed more treatment. Every possible outcome supported her narrative. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to force him to see what was happening. Instead, I squeezed his hand gently. I'm glad you feel calm. After dinner, which David barely touched, I excused myself to grade papers while he returned to his drafting table. But instead of opening my bag of student essays, I sat on our bed with my laptop and began researching everything I could find about prescription fraud, medical ethics violations, and the regulatory oversight of physicians. What I found was both encouraging and terrifying. The Washington State Medical Board took allegations of prescription fraud seriously, especially when it involved controlled substances and deceased patients. The penalties could include license suspension, criminal charges, and professional disgrace. But the burden of proof was high, and accusations against respected physicians required substantial evidence. One prescription bottle wouldn't be enough. I needed more. Documentation of the pattern, evidence of the systematic nature of Victoria's fraud, proof that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger scheme to feed her addiction and maintain her control over the people around her. I created a new folder on my laptop titled Teaching Resources and began documenting everything I could remember. Dates of David's appointments, changes in his behavior and their timeline, Victoria's comments about his condition and treatment, the names of other patients she'd mentioned over the months, her own behavioral changes, the defensive reactions, the physical symptoms I dismissed as stress. The prescription bottle sat on my nightstand like a challenge, orange plastic glowing in the lamplight. Margaret Chen. I Googled the name and found an obituary from August, a beloved grandmother who had fought cancer bravely and died peacefully surrounded by family. She'd been 73 years old and had volunteered at the children's hospital where Victoria worked. The cruelty of using a dead child advocate's name to obtain drugs hit me like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just committing fraud, she was desecrating the memory of someone who had dedicated her final years to helping the same children Victoria was supposed to protect. I heard David moving around in the living room, the sound of papers being shuffled and put away. Soon he would come to bed, and we'd lie beside each other in the darkness, both carrying secrets neither of us knew how to share. He was hiding his confusion and doubt behind compliance with Victoria's treatment. I was hiding my growing certainty that the person he trusted to heal him was actually destroying him. My phone buzzed with a text message. Victoria. Thinking about our conversation today, I really think David needs to increase his medication. Can you encourage him to call me tomorrow? Even now, even after everything I'd discovered, she was continuing the manipulation. The text was perfectly crafted, concerned, professional, positioning me as her ally in David's treatment rather than the persons whose relationship she was systematically undermining. I stared at the message for several minutes before typing back, "I'll talk to him." Another lie to add to the growing collection. But this one felt different. Not like a betrayal of truth, but like a strategic retreat. I was buying time, gathering information, preparing for a confrontation I wasn't sure I was ready for, but knew was inevitable. David appeared in the bedroom doorway, already changed into sleep clothes. He looked exhausted, older than his 31 years old. Coming to bed? In a minute. I closed the laptop and slipped the prescription bottle into my nightstand drawer, beneath a stack of unread novels. How are you feeling?
Tired. Victoria says that's normal, that treating anxiety can be exhausting at first. David slid under the covers, his movements careful and deliberate. She thinks the fatigue means the medication is working, that my body is finally relaxing after years of hypervigilance.
Or it means you're being systematically drugged by someone with her own addiction to feed, I thought, but didn't say. Instead, I turned off the lamp and settled beside him in the darkness. Elena. David's voice was soft in the dark. Do you think I'm getting better? The question broke my heart because I could hear how desperately he wanted reassurance, how much he needed to believe that the confusion and doubt he was feeling were part of a healing process rather than evidence of being harmed. I think you're exactly who you're supposed to be, I said, which was both true and not an answer to his question. David was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, Victoria says that kind of thinking is part of the problem, that accepting anxiety as normal prevents people from getting the help they need. Even my attempts to support him were being reframed as obstacles to his treatment. Victoria had created a closed system where any input that contradicted her narrative was evidence of denial, enabling, or misunderstanding. She'd positioned herself as the sole authority on David's well-being, while systematically undermining his trust in his own perceptions and mine. I lay awake long after David's breathing evened into sleep, staring at the ceiling and planning my next moves. Tomorrow I would call in sick to school, something I'd never done for personal reasons in 5 years of teaching. I would spend the day researching Victoria's patient history, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. I would visit the medical board's offices and learn about the complaint process. I would find a way to document her drug use and prescription fraud. Most importantly, I would figure out how to save David from someone he trusted completely, someone who was destroying him one prescription at a time, while convincing him it was medicine. The rain picked up outside our bedroom window, droplets racing down the glass like tears. I thought about Margaret Chen's obituary, about the grief her family must have felt, about the violation of using her name to feed an addiction. I thought about all the patients who trusted Victoria with their children's lives, unaware that their doctor was struggling with substances that could impair her judgment and reaction times. But mostly I thought about David, sleeping fitfully beside me, caught in a web of manipulation so expertly woven he couldn't see the threads that bound him. Tomorrow I would begin the process of cutting him free, even if it meant destroying my relationship with my sister and everything our family believed about who she was. The prescription bottle in my nightstand drawer seemed to pulse with possibility and threat, evidence and weapon, proof and destruction. I had a choice to make, and I was finally ready to make it.
The elevator to the 10th floor seemed to rise in slow motion, giving me too much time to reconsider what I was about to do. This wasn't just about reporting prescription fraud. This was about destroying the career of someone who had dedicated 8 years to saving children's lives. Victoria might be manipulating David and feeding her own addiction, but she was still performing surgery on tiny hearts and brains, still being trusted by desperate parents who saw her as their last hope. The receptionist at the medical board was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a neat bun. Her nameplate read Patricia Williams, and she looked up from her computer with the patience of someone who had heard every possible complaint against medical professionals. "How can I help you today?" "I need to report a physician," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth, "for prescription fraud and treating family members inappropriately." Patricia's expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of interest in her eyes. "I'll need you to speak with an investigator. Let me see who's available." She made a phone call, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite catch.
Within minutes, a tall black woman in a navy suit approached the reception desk. She was probably in her early 40s, with an authoritative bearing that suggested she had heard every story and seen every form of medical misconduct imaginable. "I'm Dr. Amelia Washington," she said, extending her hand. "I'm a board investigator. I understand you have concerns about a physician's conduct." Her handshake was firm, professional. "Yes, my sister, Dr. Victoria Reyes. She's a pediatric surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital." Dr. Washington's eyebrows rose slightly. "Family member complaints require careful handling. Let's talk in my office." She led me down a corridor lined with certificates and photographs of medical board members, past offices where other investigators were presumably unraveling other doctors' professional lives. Her office was small but organized, with law books lining one wall and a window overlooking Elliott Bay. The view was spectacular, but I couldn't appreciate it with the weight of what I was about to do. "Please sit." Dr. Washington settled behind her desk and opened a new file. "Before we begin, I need to explain that allegations against family members are taken very seriously, but they also require a higher standard of evidence. Personal conflicts can sometimes be misinterpreted as professional misconduct." "I understand." I pulled the prescription bottle from my purse and placed it on her desk. "This fell out of Victoria's purse yesterday. The patient name is Margaret Chen, but Mrs. Chen died of cancer 2 months ago. I found her obituary." Dr. Washington picked up the bottle carefully, examining the label with the trained eye of someone who had seen countless fraudulent prescriptions. "How did you come to be in possession of this?" "I was visiting Victoria's apartment. She took a phone call, and when she stood up quickly, this fell from her purse." The truth, though not the complete truth. I hadn't mentioned searching for evidence or my growing suspicions about Victoria's addiction. "And you recognize the patient name?" Victoria had mentioned Mrs. Chen before. She volunteered at the children's hospital where Victoria worked. She was one of Victoria's favorite volunteers until the cancer took her. I felt guilty using Margaret Chen's memory this way, but the woman deserved justice for having her name used to feed someone else's addiction. Dr. Washington made notes in her file. "What other concerns do you have about your sister's practice?" This was the harder part, explaining the manipulation without sounding like a jealous sister trying to sabotage a successful sibling. "She's been treating my boyfriend, David Morrison, outside normal patient protocols. No official records, no oversight. She's prescribed anxiety medication that's changed his personality, made him dependent on her medical opinions for decisions that have nothing to do with his health."
Can you be more specific about these changes? I opened my manila folder and began reading from the timeline I'd created. 3 months ago, David was confident, decisive, enjoyed hiking and outdoor activities. Since starting Victoria's medication, he's become withdrawn, constantly second-guessing himself, experiencing fatigue and decreased appetite. She's convinced him these are signs that his anxiety is worse than he realized, that he needs more intensive treatment. What kind of intensive treatment? She's suggested residential facilities, extended therapy programs that would remove him from work and our shared life entirely. I paused, letting the implications sink in. She's also begun diagnosing behaviors that were never problems before, calling his professional attention to detail obsessive-compulsive tendencies, reframing his competence as pathology. Dr. Washington continued taking notes, her expression remaining carefully neutral. "Do you have documentation of these treatment recommendations?" I handed her printed screenshots of Victoria's text messages, the careful professional language that masked manipulation as medical concern. She's been texting me about David's treatment, asking me to encourage him to increase his medication or schedule additional appointments. The boyfriend, David, is he aware of your concerns?
No. Victoria has convinced him that questioning her treatment would be both ungrateful and potentially dangerous. She's made him feel indebted to her for treating him as a favor, while simultaneously undermining his trust in his own perceptions. The words poured out faster now, months of suppressed worry finding their voice. She's created a perfect trap. When he feels good, it's evidence he's not recognizing his symptoms. When he feels bad, it proves he needs more treatment. Dr. Washington set down her pen and studied me carefully. These are serious allegations, Ms. Reyes. Prescription fraud involving controlled substances can result in criminal charges. Treating family members without proper protocols violates multiple ethical guidelines. If your sister is struggling with substance abuse, that adds another layer of complexity. I know how this sounds. I know it looks like family drama or sibling rivalry, but Victoria is performing surgery on children while potentially impaired. She's manipulating vulnerable patients and their families. Someone has to stop her before she hurts someone who can't fight back. What evidence of impairment have you observed? I thought back to all the small signs I'd dismissed or rationalized. Tremor in her hands that she tries to hide, pupils that seem too small sometimes, defensive reactions when anyone mentions work stress or patient loads, mood swings that she attributes to the demands of her job. And now this, I gestured to the prescription bottle on her desk, using dead patients' names to obtain controlled substances. Dr. Washington nodded slowly. I'm going to open a formal investigation. This will involve interviewing your sister, reviewing her prescription history, and potentially examining her patient records. You should know that she'll likely learn you initiated this complaint. The reality of that hit me like a physical blow. Victoria would know I'd betrayed her trust, stolen evidence from her apartment, reported her to the authorities that could end her career. Our relationship, already strained by her manipulation of David, would be destroyed completely. I understand, I managed. I also need to warn you about potential retaliation. If your sister is indeed struggling with addiction and feels cornered, she might escalate her manipulation of your boyfriend or attempt to discredit you in other ways. Dr. Washington's voice carried the weight of experience with complicated family dynamics. Do you have somewhere safe to stay if needed? Safe? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the medical and legal aspects of Victoria's behavior that I hadn't considered she might pose a physical threat.
Addiction can make people desperate. If Dr. Reyes realizes her prescription fraud has been discovered, she might take actions to protect herself or eliminate perceived threats. Dr. Washington's matter-of-fact tone made the words even more chilling. I'm not trying to frighten you, just ensuring you're prepared for various scenarios. I thought about David, trusting and vulnerable in his current state, dependent on Victoria's continued goodwill for medication he believed he needed. If Victoria felt threatened, would she turn him against me? Increase his dosage to make him more compliant? Convince him that my accusations were symptoms of my own mental health problems? What happens next? I asked. We'll begin by verifying the prescription fraud, checking Mrs. Chen's medical records, reviewing Dr. Reyes's prescribing history, looking for patterns of suspicious activity. If we find evidence supporting your allegations, we'll conduct a formal hearing where your sister can respond to the charges. Dr. Washington handed me a business card and a thick packet of papers. This explains the investigation process and your rights as a complainant. It also includes resources for family members of healthcare professionals struggling with addiction. I stared at the packet, the weight of bureaucratic process reducing Victoria's destruction to forms and procedures. How long does this usually take? It depends on the complexity of the case and Dr. Reyes's cooperation, anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Dr. Washington's expression softened slightly. I know this is difficult. Family members who report physicians often struggle with guilt and divided loyalties, but you've potentially prevented serious harm to patients, and may help your sister get the treatment she needs. Treatment. The word sounded hollow when applied to someone who had spent months manipulating the person I loved while hiding behind professional authority. But I nodded anyway, gathering my papers and standing to leave. "One more thing," Dr. Washington said as I reached the door. "If you observe any immediate threats to patient safety, if you believe Dr. Reyes is practicing while impaired, contact us immediately. We can take emergency action to suspend her privileges while the investigation proceeds." The elevator gown felt different from the one up, heavier with consequence and possibility. I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, set in motion events that would reshape my family and potentially save David from continued manipulation. But I'd also betrayed my sister's trust and initiated a process that could destroy her life. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for several minutes trying to process what I'd done. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "David called to schedule an appointment for Thursday. I think we need to discuss increasing his dosage. Can you join us? I'd like your input as his partner." The casual manipulation in those few sentences, positioning herself as the medical authority while making me complicit in David's treatment, would have worked on me just days ago. Now it read like evidence of the systematic control she'd been exerting over both our lives. I typed back, "I'll be there." But this time, I wouldn't be attending as her ally or David's supportive girlfriend. I'd be there as a witness, documenting her behavior for the investigation I'd just initiated. My hands shook as I started the car, the prescription bottle now secured in an evidence bag Dr. Washington had provided. Margaret Chen's name stared up at me from the label, a dead woman conscripted into feeding someone else's addiction. I thought about her family, grieving her loss while unaware that her identity was being used to obtain drugs. They deserved to know, but telling them would mean revealing what I'd done before the investigation was complete. The drive home took me past Seattle Children's Hospital, the building where Victoria spent her days performing miracles on tiny patients whose families trusted her with their most precious possessions. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who devoted her professional life to healing children was simultaneously poisoning the relationships of the people closest to her. I parked outside our apartment building and called my principal, Mrs. Rodriguez. "I'm feeling better," I lied smoothly. "I should be able to come in tomorrow." "Don't rush it. Food poisoning can be tricky. You don't want to relapse." Her concern was genuine, making me feel guilty for the deception, but I couldn't explain that I needed tomorrow to observe Victoria's interaction with David, to document behavior that might provide evidence for an investigation that could determine both their futures.
Upstairs, David was exactly where I'd left him, at his drafting table, staring at plans, with the confused frustration that had become his default expression. But today I saw it differently, not as evidence of anxiety or work stress, but as the result of medication that was clouding his judgment and undermining his confidence. "How are you feeling?" I asked, settling on the couch where I could observe him without seeming to interrogate. "Tired, confused." David rubbed his temples, a gesture that had become habitual. "I keep making mistakes on these plans, basic errors I've never made before. Victoria's right about the anxiety affecting my work." "What kind of mistakes?" David gestured to his drafting table, where eraser shavings littered the surface. "Measurement errors. Forgetting to account for structural requirements I've known by heart for years. Yesterday I spent an hour on a calculation that should have taken 5 minutes. I looked at the plans, noting the careful precision of his lines despite the errors he was describing. David's draftsmanship had always been meticulous, but now it seemed almost obsessive. Every line traced and retraced, every measurement double and triple checked, not because of natural perfectionism, but because he no longer trusted his own competence. "Maybe you're overthinking things," I suggested carefully. "That's what Victoria says, that anxiety can create mental loops that make simple tasks feel impossible." David set down his pencil and turned to face me. "She wants to adjust my medication again, thinks we need to try a different approach." "Different how?"
something stronger. She mentioned that sometimes anxiety requires more aggressive treatment before it gets better. David's voice carried uncertainty, as if he was testing the words. She also thinks I should take that time off we discussed, give the new medication a chance to work without work stress interfering. The trap was tightening. Victoria was systematically removing David from every source of confidence and competence in his life, making him increasingly dependent on her guidance while convincing him it was medical necessity. "What do you think about that?" I asked, though I could see in his expression that his own opinions had become secondary to Victoria's professional recommendations. "I don't know what to think anymore. Sometimes I feel like myself, but then Victoria points out behaviors that suggest the anxiety is worse than I realize. How can I trust my own judgment about mental health when the condition itself affects judgment?" It was a perfect psychological trap. Victoria had convinced David that his mental illness prevented him from accurately assessing his mental health, making her the sole authority on his well-being. Any resistance to her treatment recommendations could be dismissed as symptoms of the very condition she was supposedly treating. My phone rang, Victoria's name appearing on the screen. David gestured for me to answer, his deference to her extending even to phone calls. "Elena? I just wanted to confirm Thursday's appointment. I think it would be really helpful if you could join us." Victoria's voice carried that perfect blend of professional concern and sisterly affection that had fooled me for so long. "Of course. What time?" 2:00. And, Elena, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about you seeming stressed. I'm wondering if watching David struggle with anxiety is affecting your own mental health." Victoria's voice took on a clinical tone. "It's very common for partners of anxiety
Patients to develop secondary symptoms, hypervigilance, relationship concerns, difficulty trusting the treatment process. Even now, even after I'd reported her to the medical board, she was working to undermine my credibility. If I questioned her treatment of David, it would be evidence of my own psychological instability rather than legitimate concern. "I'm fine," I said, watching David listen to my side of the conversation with growing concern. "Sometimes patients' families don't recognize when they need support too. I'd be happy to recommend someone you could talk to, a colleague who specializes in family therapy for anxiety-related issues." The offer sounded generous, caring. In reality, it was another attempt to control the narrative around David's treatment by pathologizing any opposition to her methods. If I saw a therapist she recommended, that person would likely receive a carefully crafted version of events that portrayed me as an anxious partner, unable to accept her boyfriend's mental health diagnosis. "I'll think about it," I said. "Good. Oh, and Elena, I wanted you to know that David called me this morning. He seemed quite distressed about his work performance. I think we really need to consider that residential treatment option, somewhere he can focus on healing without external pressures." My blood ran cold. Victoria was escalating her timeline, pushing to remove David from my influence entirely. The residential treatment she'd mentioned would give her complete control over his medication, his therapy, his reality. By the time he emerged, if he emerged, he might be so thoroughly convinced of his mental illness that he'd never question her treatment again. "We'll discuss it Thursday," I managed. After hanging up, I found David staring at me with an expression of worry and confusion. "Victoria thinks I called her this morning? I don't remember calling her. This was new. Memory issues that couldn't be explained by anxiety alone?" I felt a chill of recognition, remembering articles I'd read about benzodiazepine side effects, about how certain medications could cause blackouts and memory loss while leaving patients functional enough to make phone calls they wouldn't remember. "What's the last thing you remember about this morning?" I asked carefully. David frowned, concentrating. "Having coffee with you, then working on these plans, but there's a gap somewhere in the middle. I thought I'd just lost track of time." Memory gaps were a serious side effect, one that suggested Victoria might be giving David higher doses than he realized or medications he wasn't aware of taking. The thought of her manipulating an impaired David into making phone calls that furthered her agenda made me feel physically sick. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about it." I moved closer, taking his hands in mine. How do you actually feel? Not how Victoria says you should feel, not what the medication is supposed to do. How do you feel in your body, in your mind? He was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes searching my face as if looking for permission to be honest. Foggy, he finally said. Like I'm thinking through cotton, and disconnected, like I'm watching my life happen to someone else. But Victoria says that's normal, that anxiety can create dissociation. When did you last feel like yourself? David paused, really considering the question. I can't remember. It's been gradual, so I thought it was just stress, just getting older. But now that you ask, his voice trailed off, and I could see him trying to piece together a timeline that had been obscured by pharmaceutical fog.
I wanted to tell him everything about the prescription bottle, about the investigation, about the systematic way Victoria had been manipulating both of us. But Dr. Washington had warned me about potential retaliation, and David was still too vulnerable to handle the truth. Instead, I squeezed his hands gently. I think you should trust your own feelings more, I said. Your instincts about your own body, your own mind. But what if I'm wrong? What if the anxiety is making me think I feel better than I actually do? David's voice carried the fear that Victoria had instilled in him, that his own perceptions couldn't be trusted. What if you're right? I countered. What if you know your own body better than anyone else? It was a radical suggestion in the context of Victoria's treatment, the idea that David might be the ultimate authority on his own experience. I could see him struggling with it, months of conditioning, warring with some deeper instinct for self-preservation. That evening, I made David's favorite dinner, salmon with lemon and herbs, roasted vegetables, the comfort food that had always brought him joy. He ate more than he had in weeks, commenting on the flavors with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in months. "This is really good," he said, seeming surprised by his own appetite. "I seem more present tonight," I observed. David considered this. "I do feel more present, more like myself." Then his expression clouded. "But Victoria says that's misleading, that anxiety can create periods of false wellness that prevent patients from maintaining consistent treatment." Even in moments of clarity, Victoria's voice was there, undermining David's trust in his own experience. I realized that breaking her psychological hold over him would be as difficult as proving her prescription fraud. Both required dismantling carefully constructed lies that had become someone's reality. After dinner, I excused myself to grade papers while David returned to his drafting table. But instead of student essays, I spent the evening researching residential psychiatric facilities, looking for the places Victoria might recommend. What I found was disturbing. Programs that charged enormous fees for extended stays, treatments that could last months or years, facilities with histories of keeping patients longer than medically necessary. If Victoria succeeded in convincing David to enter residential treatment, she could control every aspect of his recovery while draining his savings and isolating him from anyone who might question her methods. It was the perfect long-term solution to the problem I represented, a way to remove David from my influence entirely while positioning herself as his savior. I also researched the timeline for medical board investigations, hoping Dr. Washington had been pessimistic about the 6-month to 2-year time frame, but what I found confirmed her estimates. These cases moved slowly, deliberately, with multiple opportunities for the accused physician to respond and defend themselves. Victoria would have months to solidify her control over David, to implement whatever final phase of her manipulation she was planning. The investigation I'd initiated might ultimately save other patients and provide justice for Margaret Chen's memory, but it wouldn't happen fast enough to save David from whatever Victoria was preparing to do to him. My phone buzzed with another text from Victoria. "David sounded really distressed when he called today. I'm worried he might be having more severe anxiety than we realized. We may need to discuss emergency intervention options on Thursday."
Emergency intervention. The words sent ice through my veins. In psychiatric terminology, that could mean involuntary commitment, forced treatment, legal mechanisms that would remove David's autonomy entirely. Victoria was laying the groundwork for the most extreme form of control possible, convincing everyone that David was too mentally ill to make decisions about his own treatment. I stared at the text for several minutes before responding. I'll see you Thursday.
But I wouldn't be going to that appointment as the supportive girlfriend of an anxiety patient. I'd be going as the sister of a physician under investigation, armed with knowledge and determination to protect the man I loved from someone who had twisted healing into harm. Thursday was 2 days away. 2 days to prepare, to document, to find a way to save David before Victoria's emergency intervention could destroy what remained of his autonomy and self-trust. The prescription bottle sat in my nightstand drawer like a ticking bomb. Margaret Chen's name, a reminder of all the ways medical authority could be abused. Thursday would determine whether that bomb exploded in Victoria's face or mine. Thursday arrived gray and drizzling, Seattle's perpetual autumn weather matching my mood as I drove toward Victoria's medical office. I had spent the previous day researching everything I could about psychiatric holds, emergency interventions, and the legal rights of patients being evaluated for involuntary commitment. What I'd learned had filled me with a cold determination that surprised me with its intensity. David sat in the passenger seat, unusually quiet even for his medicated state. He'd been experiencing more memory gaps, losing track of conversations, forgetting tasks he had planned to complete, staring at his architectural plans as if they were written in a foreign language. This morning he asked me 3 times what day it was, each instance apparently wiped from his mind within minutes. "Elena?" His voice was soft, uncertain. "Do you think I'm getting worse?" The question broke my heart because I could hear the genuine confusion in it. David was trying to make sense of symptoms that didn't fit any natural progression of anxiety disorder, changes that seemed to accelerate rather than improve with treatment. "I think you're exactly where you need to be," I said, which was both true and evasive. Where he needed to be was away from Victoria's influence, but I couldn't tell him that yet. Victoria's office was in a medical complex near the hospital, a sleek building that spoke of success and professional authority. The waiting room was decorated in soothing blues and grays, with abstract art and the kind of furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and the air smelled of lavender and antiseptic. "Dr. Reyes will see you now," the receptionist announced, her smile professional and warm. Victoria's office was larger than I had expected, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the hospital campus where she spent her days performing surgery. Her diplomas and certifications covered one wall: Harvard Medical School, pediatric surgery residency at Boston Children's Hospital, board certifications, and professional awards that spoke of a brilliant career built on healing children. It made what she was doing to David even more incomprehensible. "David, Elena, please sit." Victoria rose from behind her desk, her movements graceful and controlled. She looked perfect, as always. Professional blazer, tasteful jewelry, makeup that enhanced rather than conceal. Only I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she gestured toward the chairs arranged in front of her desk. "How are you feeling, David?" Victoria's voice carried the practiced concern of someone accustomed to managing anxious patients. "Confused," David admitted. "The memory issues are getting worse. This morning I forgot entire conversations we had yesterday." Victoria made notes on a tablet, her stylus moving with clinical precision. Memory problems can be a symptom of severe anxiety. When the mind is constantly in fight-or-flight mode, it has difficulty forming and retrieving memories properly.
But memory problems were also a side effect of benzodiazepine toxicity, something I'd learned during my research but couldn't mention without revealing what I knew about Victoria's prescribing practices. I'm also concerned about the medication's effectiveness, David continued. I don't feel like myself anymore. I feel disconnected from everything. That's actually a good sign, Victoria said smoothly. It suggests the medication is interrupting the anxiety cycle. The disconnection you're experiencing is your nervous system finally relaxing after years of hypervigilance. I watched Victoria as she spoke, noting the careful way she reframed every one of David's concerns as evidence that her treatment was working. His confusion became proof of healing. His memory loss became a side effect of anxiety rather than medication. His sense of disconnection became therapeutic progress rather than chemical impairment. However, Victoria continued, I am concerned about the severity of your symptoms. The memory issues, in particular, suggest your anxiety may be more treatment-resistant than we initially thought. Here it came, the setup for whatever escalation she had planned. I've been consulting with colleagues about your case, and we believe you might benefit from a more intensive approach. Victoria's voice took on the tone of someone delivering difficult but necessary news. There's a residential facility in Portland that specializes in treatment-resistant anxiety disorders. Their program combines medication management with intensive therapy in a controlled environment. David's face went pale. Residential treatment? For how long? Typically 3 to 6 months, though some patients benefit from longer stays. Victoria's matter-of-fact delivery made the timeline sound reasonable rather than devastating. I know it seems extreme, but your symptoms are progressing despite outpatient treatment. The memory issues alone are concerning enough to warrant more intensive intervention. I felt anger building in my chest, hot and righteous. Victoria was using David's medication-induced symptoms as justification for further medication and isolation. She had created the very problems she was now claiming to solve. What about his work? I asked, my voice carefully controlled. David just started his own firm. 6 months away could destroy everything he's built. Victoria turned to me with that practiced expression of professional sympathy. I understand this is difficult, Elena, but David's mental health has to be the priority. What good is a successful business if he's too anxious to function? The twisted logic was breathtaking. Victoria was preparing to destroy David's livelihood while positioning it as medical necessity, making me appear selfish for wanting to preserve his career and independence. I'd like to speak with Elena privately for a moment. Would you mind waiting in the reception area? This will just take a few minutes. David nodded obediently, his natural deference to medical authority overriding any instinct to question being excluded from conversations about his own treatment. After he left, Victoria's expression shifted subtly, becoming more calculating. Elena, I need to be frank with you. David's condition is more serious than I initially realized. The memory issues, the disconnection, the inability to function at work, these aren't typical anxiety symptoms. I'm beginning to suspect there might be an underlying psychiatric condition that requires more aggressive treatment. What kind of condition? Possibly early-stage psychosis or a mood disorder with psychotic features. The way he's been describing his experiences, feeling disconnected from reality, questioning his own perceptions, these could be warning signs of a more serious mental illness. The audacity was staggering. Victoria was reframing David's medication-induced confusion as symptoms of psychosis, creating a medical emergency that would justify involuntary commitment if necessary. She was manufacturing a psychiatric crisis to cover up the iatrogenic damage her treatment had already caused. I think you're wrong, I said quietly. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. I understand this is difficult to accept. It's natural for family members to resist psychiatric diagnoses, especially serious ones. But denial can be dangerous when someone's mental health is deteriorating. I'm not in denial. I think David's problems are medication-related, not psychiatric. The change in Victoria's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The mask of professional concern slipped just enough to reveal something harder underneath. Elena, you're not medically trained. You can't distinguish between medication side effects and psychiatric symptoms. That's why we need professional evaluation in a controlled setting. What about getting a second opinion, another psychiatrist evaluation before committing to residential treatment? There isn't time for that luxury, Victoria said sharply, then seemed to catch herself and soften her tone. David's symptoms are progressing rapidly. Every day we delay treatment increases the risk of permanent psychological damage. This was the moment of truth. Victoria was pushing for immediate action because she knew that any independent evaluation would reveal the iatrogenic nature of David's symptoms. She needed to get him into a controlled environment where she could manage the narrative and continue medicating him without outside oversight. "I won't support this," I said firmly. Victoria's mask slipped further. "You don't have a choice. If David is experiencing a psychiatric emergency, I can initiate an involuntary hold for evaluation. His safety takes precedence over your emotional comfort." There it was, the threat I'd been expecting. Victoria was prepared to use her medical authority to force David into treatment, whether he consented or not. She would destroy his autonomy and civil rights to protect her manipulation and avoid exposure of her prescription fraud. On what grounds? I challenged. Danger to self due to impaired judgment and inability to care for his basic needs. The memory loss alone suggests cognitive impairment that could result in self-harm through neglect or poor decision-making. Victoria had got this through carefully, building a case for involuntary commitment based on symptoms she'd created through over-medicating him. It was a perfect trap. The worse David got from her treatment, the more justified her extreme interventions became. I thought about the prescription bottle sitting in Dr. Washington's evidence file, about the investigation that was moving too slowly to save David from this immediate threat. Victoria didn't know about the medical board complaint yet, but when she found out, she might accelerate her timeline even further. "What if I told you I know about Margaret Chen?" I said quietly. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Victoria went completely still, her face draining of color except for 2 spots of red high on her cheekbones. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic from the street below. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot of Margaret Chen's obituary. She died 2 months ago, but somehow she's still getting prescriptions for oxycodone in your name. Victoria stared at the screen for a long moment, and I watched her calculating options, weighing responses, trying to determine how much I actually knew. "Where did you get that information?"
Does it matter? The question is how long you've been using dead patients' names to feed your addiction, and how many people you've manipulated to cover it up. Victoria's composure cracked completely. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window overlooking the hospital campus. When she turned back to face me, her expression was a mixture of desperation and rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, but the words sounded hollow. "I'm trying to help David, and you're interfering with his treatment because of some paranoid conspiracy theory." "The conspiracy theory where you're drugging my boyfriend to make him dependent on you while using dead patients' identities to get pills for yourself?" "I am not drugging anyone," Victoria's voice rose. Then she seemed to remember where we were and lowered it to a harsh whisper. "David has a legitimate anxiety disorder that requires medication. If you can't accept that, it's because you're too emotionally invested to see clearly." But I could see the fear in her eyes now, the recognition that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. She was still trying to manipulate me, but desperation was making her clumsy. "Then why are you so eager to get him into residential treatment? Why the rush to remove him from everyone who might question your diagnosis?" "Because his condition is deteriorating." Victoria's professional mask was completely gone now, replaced with something raw and dangerous. "And because interference from family members like you is making it worse. You're enabling his denial, preventing him from getting the help he needs. Or you're afraid that independent evaluation will reveal what you've been doing to him." Victoria's laugh was bitter and sharp.
You think you're so clever, don't you? Playing detective, imagining conspiracies. But you're just a high school English teacher who's in way over her head. The contempt in her voice was shocking. Not just professional dismissal, but personal cruelty aimed at undermining my confidence and credibility. This was how Victoria really saw me, not as a sister or equal, but as an obstacle to be managed or eliminated. Maybe, but I'm a high school English teacher who reported you to the medical board yesterday. The effect was explosive. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, fury, and finally something that looked like panic. She gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white with tension. You did what? I gave them the prescription bottle with Margaret Chen's name on it. I documented David's treatment and the way you've been manipulating both of us. They're opening a formal investigation. Victoria's breathing became rapid and shallow, and for a moment I wondered if she was having a panic attack. Then her expression hardened into something cold and calculating. You stupid, vindictive bitch. Do you have any idea what you've done? The venom in her voice was like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain calm. I've stopped you from hurting more people. You've destroyed everything. My career, my reputation, my ability to help the children who depend on me. Victoria's voice rose again, tears of rage gathering in her eyes. And for what? Because you're jealous of my success? Because you can't handle that David trusts my medical judgment more than your amateur psychology? I did it because you're addicted to prescription drugs and you're using patients to feed your addiction, because you've been systematically destroying David's mental health to control him, because someone has to protect the people you're supposed to be healing. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, processing the new reality and adapting to it. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled, but filled with malice.
You want to play this game? Fine. But remember that David is still my patient, and his medical records will show a clear progression of psychiatric symptoms that required intensive intervention. When the medical board interviews him, they'll find someone so confused and disconnected that he can barely function, hardly a credible witness to anything. The threat was clear. Victoria was prepared to increase David's medication to make him even more impaired, rendering him unable to provide coherent testimony about her treatment. She would use his vulnerability as a weapon against both of us. And Elena? Victoria's smile was sharp as a scalpel. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected pediatric surgeon with 8 years of exemplary service? Or a paranoid sister making wild accusations based on jealousy and misunderstanding? Before I could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Dr. Reyes? The receptionist's voice was apologetic. Mr. Morrison seems to be having some difficulty. Should I call for assistance?
You drugged him, I said, loud enough for the receptionist and other waiting patients to hear. I medicated a patient experiencing acute psychiatric symptoms, Victoria corrected, but her voice carried an edge of desperation. Elena, you're interfering with medical treatment. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I'm not leaving without David. David is unable to make decisions about his care in his current state. As his treating physician, I have the authority to act in his best interests. We were at an impasse, and I could see Victoria calculating her next move. She had David sedated and confused, medical authority on her side, and witnesses who would see only a doctor trying to help a patient while a hysterical family member interfered with treatment. That's when Dr. Washington walked into the waiting room. Her presence was like a bomb going off in slow motion. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally terror as she realized that the medical board investigator she'd probably been expecting to meet under controlled circumstances had instead walked into the middle of her actively sedating a patient. Dr. Reyes, Dr. Washington said calmly. "I'm Dr. Amelia Washington from the medical board. We need to speak." "This isn't a good time," Victoria managed. "I have a patient experiencing a psychiatric emergency." Dr. Washington looked at David, who was now slumped in his chair with his eyes closed, then at me, then back at Victoria. "What medications did you administer?" "Standard anxiolytics for acute anxiety with psychotic features," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'd like to see the medical orders and documentation for this treatment." Victoria's silence stretched too long. Dr. Washington pulled out her phone and made a call. "This is Dr. Washington with the medical board. I need paramedics at 1247 Madison Street, Suite 502. Patient appears to have been oversedated. Also requesting police backup for a medical investigation." "That's not necessary," Victoria protested. "I can provide appropriate medical care." "Dr. Reyes, you're currently under investigation for prescription fraud and inappropriate treatment of family members. Finding you in the process of sedating that same family member constitutes a significant escalation of the allegations against you." The waiting room had gone completely silent, except for the sound of David's labored breathing. Other patients and staff were staring at the scene unfolding before them, a respected doctor being confronted by a medical board investigator while her patient sat unconscious in a chair. "Furthermore," Dr. Washington continued, "I'm placing you under immediate suspension pending emergency review. You are not to treat any patients or prescribe any medications until this investigation is complete." Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. "You can't do this. I have surgery scheduled, patients who depend on me, children who need operations that only I can perform." "Those children will be transferred to other qualified surgeons. Your patient's safety takes precedence over your professional convenience." The paramedics arrived within minutes, followed closely by 2 police officers. They loaded David onto a stretcher, his vital signs stable but his consciousness significantly impaired. I rode with him to the hospital holding his hand, while the paramedics documented his condition and the medications Victoria had admitted to administering.
At the emergency room, the attending physician, Dr. Sarah Kim, was appalled by what she found in David's system. "This is enough haloperidol to sedate someone having a full psychotic break," she told me after reviewing his blood work. "For someone with no history of psychosis, this dosage could have caused serious respiratory depression or cardiac complications." "Will he be okay?" "He should be fine once the medications clear his system, but it could take 12 to 24 hours. We'll need to monitor him closely." Dr. Kim's expression was grim. "I have to ask, did he consent to this treatment?" "He was told it was a mild anxiety medication to help him tolerate a medical appointment." Dr. Kim made notes in David's chart, her pen moving with angry precision. "This constitutes medical assault. The police will want to speak with you about pressing charges." While David slept off the effects of Victoria's chemical assault, I found myself in the strange position of being both victim and witness in a criminal investigation. Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen every variety of human cruelty, interviewed me in the hospital's family conference room. "Tell me about your sister's behavior leading up to today's incident," she said, her recorder sitting between us on the small table. I told her everything. The prescription fraud, the manipulation of David's treatment, the systematic undermining of his confidence and autonomy. As I spoke, I could see Detective Santos making connections between my account and whatever evidence Dr. Washington had already provided. "How long do you think this has been going on?" "The prescription fraud? I don't know. The manipulation of David started 3 months ago when she began treating him. Any idea what triggered her to escalate to physical sedation today?" I thought about our confrontation in Victoria's office, about the moment her mask had finally slipped completely. I told her I'd reported her to the medical board. She was trying to get David into residential treatment before the investigation could proceed. When I opposed it, she decided to create a psychiatric emergency that would justify involuntary commitment. Detective Santos nodded grimly.
We see this sometimes with medical professionals who develop substance abuse problems. They use their authority and knowledge to exploit vulnerable patients, often family members who trust them completely. What happens now? Dr. Reyes will be arrested for assault, probably tonight. The district attorney will review the evidence for additional charges related to prescription fraud and patient abuse. The medical board will proceed with their investigation, but the criminal charges take precedence. I thought about Victoria in her beautiful penthouse apartment, surrounded by the symbols of her success and professional achievement. In a few hours, police officers would knock on her door and arrest her for crimes that would destroy everything she'd built. Part of me felt satisfied by the justice of it. Part of me felt sick about what I'd set in motion. Detective Santos? What about the children she's been operating on, her patients at the hospital? The hospital will review all her recent cases for any signs of impairment or misconduct. If she's been using drugs during surgery, Dr. Reyes, let's just say this investigation is going to expand significantly. When I returned to David's room, he was beginning to stir. His eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to recognition as he focused on my face. Elena? What happened? I feel like I've been hit by a truck.
You were drugged. Victoria gave you an antipsychotic without your knowledge or consent. David's confusion deepened. Drugged? But she's my doctor. She was treating my anxiety. This was the conversation I'd been dreading but knew was inevitable. David's trust in Victoria had been so complete that even now, faced with evidence of her betrayal, he was struggling to process the reality of what had happened to him. David, I need to tell you some things about Victoria and your treatment. But first, I need you to know that you're safe now, and everything she told you about your mental health was a lie. Over the next hour, as the sedatives slowly cleared from his system, I told David everything about the prescription fraud, about Victoria's addiction, about the way she'd systematically manipulated his treatment to serve her own needs. I showed him the timeline I'd created, the research I'd done, the evidence that had convinced the medical board to open an investigation. David's reactions cycled through disbelief, anger, confusion, and finally a devastating sadness as he realized how completely he'd been betrayed by someone he'd trusted with his life. She convinced me I was mentally ill, he said quietly. I started doubting everything about myself, my competence, my judgment, my sanity. She made me believe that questioning her treatment was a symptom of my disease. That's what she wanted. She needed you to be dependent on her, to trust her completely and never seek outside opinions. But why? What did she gain from destroying my confidence and drugging me? I thought about all the possible motivations: control, attention, the satisfaction of manipulation, the need to prove her medical authority. I think she's sick, David, not just addicted to drugs, but psychologically sick in ways that made her need to control and manipulate the people closest to her. David was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of what had been done to him. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger, more like the man I'd fallen in love with. How long will it take for these medications to get out of my system, to feel like myself again? The doctor said most of the acute effects should clear within 24 hours. But you've been on anxiety medications for 3 months. It might take longer to fully recover from that. And the memory problems, the confusion, those should improve as the drugs clear your system. Dr. Kim thinks they were side effects of the medications Victoria was giving you, not symptoms of mental illness. For the first time in months, David smiled with something approaching his old confidence. So I'm not crazy? You were never crazy. You were being poisoned by someone who convinced you it was medicine. The next morning brought news that Victoria had been arrested at her apartment, found with enough stolen prescription drugs to stock a small pharmacy. The search had revealed a sophisticated operation involving multiple deceased patients' identities, forged prescriptions, and a network of complicit pharmacy technicians who'd been paid to look the other way. Dr. Washington called to update me on the investigation's progress. We found evidence of prescription fraud going back at least 2 years. Dozens of deceased patients, hundreds of forged prescriptions. This is one of the largest cases of medical fraud we've ever prosecuted. What about her surgical patients? Were any of them harmed? The hospital is reviewing all her recent cases, but preliminary evidence suggests she was able to maintain professional competence in the operating room even while struggling with addiction. Surgery requires such intense focus that it may have been the one area where her drug use didn't affect her performance. It was a small mercy in an ocean of betrayal. Victoria's addiction hadn't killed any children, though it had nearly destroyed the man I loved and violated the trust of countless patients and families. There's something else, Dr. Washington continued. During the search of Dr. Reyes's apartment, we found detailed records of your boyfriend's treatment, medication logs, behavioral observations, plans for escalating his treatment. It appears she was conducting an unauthorized psychological experiment using him as an unwilling subject.
The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just been manipulating David to control our relationship or feed her addiction. She'd been using him as a test subject, documenting his responses to various medications and psychological interventions for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. Why would she do that? We're still investigating, but it appears she may have been planning to publish a case study about treating anxiety in high-functioning professionals. Your boyfriend's treatment was apparently being documented for potential academic publication. The cruelty was breathtaking. Victoria had been planning to advance her career by writing about the psychological destruction she'd inflicted on David, turning his suffering into professional achievement while destroying his life for research purposes. When I told David about this final betrayal, his reaction was surprisingly calm. "She turned me into a lab rat," he said quietly. "My confusion, my memory problems, my lost confidence, all of it was data for her research. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be proud." David took my hand, his grip strong and steady for the first time in months. "You saved me from someone I trusted completely. You saw through her manipulation when I couldn't. You literally saved my life." That afternoon, we left the hospital together, David walking steadily beside me with clear eyes and improving coordination. The medications were leaving his system, taking with them the fog and confusion that had clouded his mind for months. He wasn't fully recovered. That would take time and possibly professional help to undo the psychological damage Victoria had inflicted on him, but he was himself again. As we drove home past the medical complex where Victoria had once practiced, I thought about all the ways trust could be weaponized, all the ways authority could be abused. Victoria had used her medical degree, her professional reputation, and her position as my sister to gain access to David's mind and body. She'd turned healing into harm, medicine into manipulation, family love into a tool for control. But she'd also underestimated the power of love to recognize truth, even when that truth was carefully hidden behind professional authority and sisterly affection. She'd underestimated my willingness to risk everything, our relationship, our family's stability, my own reputation, to protect the person I loved from someone who was supposed to heal him. The investigation would continue for months, probably years. Victoria would face criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and the complete destruction of the career she'd worked so hard to build. Our family would be torn apart by the revelation of what she'd done, and I would have to live with the knowledge that the sister I'd looked up to my entire life was capable of cruelty I couldn't have imagined. But David was safe. The children Victoria had been treating would be protected from her impaired judgment, and other patients would be spared the manipulation and abuse she'd perfected during her months of experimenting on the man I loved.
As we pulled into our apartment complex parking lot, David reached over and squeezed my hand. He said, "Thank you." For what? For seeing what I couldn't see. For trusting your instincts when everyone else was telling you to trust hers. For saving me from someone I never would have suspected. I squeezed his hand back, feeling the strength returning to his grip, seeing the clarity returning to his eyes. Victoria had tried to destroy him, but she underestimated both his resilience and my determination to protect him. The worst was over. Now we had to figure out how to heal from what she'd done to both of us.
6 weeks after Victoria's arrest, I stood in the hallway outside courtroom 7 of the King County Superior Court, watching my parents emerge from what had been the most difficult conversation of their lives. The preliminary hearing had been a formality. Victoria's attorney had advised her to plead guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. But seeing her in orange jail scrubs, hands shackled, had broken something fundamental in our family's understanding of who we were. My mother, Elena Santos Reyes, looked as if she'd aged a decade in the past month and a half. Her usually perfect silver hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup to hide the exhaustion that had become her constant companion since Victoria's arrest made headlines across Seattle's medical community. My father, Roberto, stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders, his own face a mask of controlled grief. "She looked so small," my mother whispered. Not to anyone in particular, but to the universe that had turned her successful pediatric surgeon daughter into a criminal defendant. My Victoria looked so small in that courtroom. David waited for me at the end of the hallway, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos that had become our family's reality. Over the past 6 weeks, he'd made remarkable progress in recovering from Victoria's systematic drugging, but the healing wasn't just physical. The psychological recovery, learning to trust his own perceptions again, rebuilding confidence in his judgment, processing the violation of being used as an unwilling research subject, had required professional help from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a trauma therapist who specialized in medical abuse cases. "How are you holding up?" David asked as we walked toward the parking garage together. "I keep thinking about when we were kids," I said, my voice hollow with exhaustion. Victoria was always the golden child. Straight A's, perfect SAT scores, early admission to Harvard. She was going to save the world, one sick child at a time. Mom used to say Victoria had healing hands. She did heal children, David reminded me gently. Even with everything she did to us, she still saved lives in that operating room. It was true, and it made everything more complicated. The hospital's investigation had found no evidence that Victoria's drug use had compromised her surgical performance. If anything, her patient outcomes had been exceptional, some of the best in the pediatric surgery department. She'd somehow managed to maintain professional excellence while conducting illegal drug experiments on her sister's boyfriend and stealing prescription medications from deceased patients. The district attorney called this morning, I told David as we reached our car. Victoria's sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month. They're recommending 4 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation and permanent revocation of her medical license. David absorbed this information quietly. We'd known this day was coming. Victoria's crimes were too serious and too public for anything less than significant prison time. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were different experiences entirely. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. Relieved, guilty about feeling relieved, sad for my parents, angry that she put all of us through this. I paused, trying to untangle the complex emotions that had become my daily companions. Mostly, I feel grateful that we caught her before she could hurt more people. That was the truth that had sustained me through the hardest moments of the past 6 weeks. The knowledge that exposing Victoria had prevented future victims. The investigation had revealed that David wasn't her first target for medical manipulation. 2 previous boyfriends had experienced similar patterns of unnecessary medication and psychological control,
although neither had realized what was happening to them at the time.
Dr. Washington had interviewed both men as part of the expanded investigation. James Chen, no relation to Margaret Chen, had dated Victoria 3 years earlier and had been prescribed antidepressants for what Victoria diagnosed as major depressive disorder. His symptoms, fatigue, decreased motivation, social withdrawal, had been classic side effects of over-medication, but Victoria had convinced him they were evidence of treatment-resistant depression requiring increasingly aggressive intervention. Michael Torres, Victoria's boyfriend from 2 years ago, had been prescribed stimulants for what she'd called adult ADHD, then benzodiazepines when the stimulants predictably caused anxiety and insomnia. The cycle of medication and side effects had left him psychologically dependent on Victoria's guidance for basic life decisions until he'd finally ended the relationship and gradually weaned himself off the drugs. Both men had agreed to testify at Victoria's sentencing hearing, their stories providing crucial evidence of the systematic nature of her abuse. The pattern was clear. Victoria targeted intelligent, successful men in intimate relationships, then used her medical authority to convince them they had mental health problems requiring her exclusive treatment. The medication she prescribed created symptoms that justified further medication, while the psychological manipulation made her victims dependent on her guidance and approval. "Dr. Martinez wants to see us together next week," David said as we drove home through the quiet streets of Capitol Hill. "She thinks we're ready to start working on the relationship impacts of what happened." Therapy had been essential for both of us, though in different ways. David's individual sessions focused on recovering from medical trauma and rebuilding trust in his own perceptions. My therapy addressed the complex grief of losing a sister to addiction and criminality, along with the guilt and anger that came from having been manipulated alongside him. But we'd also needed time to rebuild our relationship, to distinguish between the problems Victoria had manufactured and the genuine challenges that existed between us. Some of David's emotional distance during their months of treatment had been medication-induced, but some had been his natural response to feeling controlled and manipulated. Some of my hypervigilance about his behavior had been justified concern about Victoria's influence, but some had been my own tendency toward anxiety and stressful situations. "I'd like that," I said. "I think we're both ready to figure out who we are together when nobody's experimenting on us." David laughed, a sound that had become more frequent as the medications left his system and his natural humor returned. "That's definitely a sentence I never thought I'd say." Our apartment building looked different to me now. Not just like home, but like a sanctuary we'd defended against someone who'd tried to destroy it. Mrs. Chen from the first floor was in the garden harvesting the last of her autumn vegetables, and she waved as we walked past. She'd become an unexpected ally during the worst weeks of the investigation, bringing us soup and offering quiet support without asking intrusive questions about the news stories that had made our names familiar to anyone following the case. "Elena, David," she called out, setting down her basket of winter squash. "How did it go today?" Victoria pleaded guilty. Sentencing is next month. Mrs. Chen nodded gravely. She'd lived through enough life to understand that some problems didn't have easy solutions, that families could be broken by actions that seemed incomprehensible to outsiders. "You did the right thing," she said simply. "Sometimes protecting people means making very hard choices." Upstairs in our apartment, David returned to his drafting table with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in months. His architectural firm had not only survived his temporary incapacitation, but had actually grown during his recovery as word spread about his innovative designs and meticulous attention to detail. Clients had been patient with his explanation that he'd been temporarily unable to work due to medical issues, and several had specifically requested his services after learning about his recovery.
"I got the permit approval for the Morrison Community Center," he announced, holding up an official-looking document. "Construction can start in the spring." The community center was David's most ambitious project, a multi-million-dollar facility that would provide after-school programs, senior services, and mental health resources for underserved neighborhoods.
Ironically, his experience as Victoria's victim had given him insights into the design of therapeutic spaces that had impressed both clients and planning committees. "That's amazing," I said, genuinely proud of his professional resurrection. "How does it feel to be back to full capacity?" "Better than full capacity," David replied, studying his plans with the focused attention that had always been one of his greatest strengths. "I feel like I understand my own work better now, like I trust my instincts in ways I didn't before." It was true. The experience of having his confidence systematically undermined had ultimately made David more aware of his own competence and judgment. He'd learned to distinguish between legitimate self-doubt, the kind that leads to careful checking and professional growth, and the manufactured uncertainty that Victoria used to control him. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The Victoria's attempt to destroy David's self-trust had ultimately strengthened it. By experiencing manipulation so profound and recognizing it, he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when someone was trying to undermine his judgment or gaslight his perceptions. I settled on the couch with a stack of student essays to grade, but found myself watching David work instead of focusing on my own responsibilities. His movements were confident and decisive, free from the second-guessing and hesitation that had characterized his behavior during Victoria's treatment. The tremor in his hands was gone, replaced by the steady precision that had made him successful as an architect. "David?" He looked up from his drafting table, pencil poised over a detailed elevation drawing. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found that prescription bottle? If Victoria had succeeded in getting you into residential treatment?" David considered the question seriously, setting down his pencil and turning to face me fully. "Sometimes I think about how close I came to losing myself completely. 6 months in a psychiatric facility, being told every day that my thoughts and feelings weren't trustworthy, being medicated into complete compliance." He shuddered slightly. "I might never have recovered my sense of self." "She almost succeeded." "But she didn't. And partly that's because she underestimated you." David's expression was serious but warm. "She thought you'd accept her medical authority the way I did. She didn't account for the fact that someone who loves you pays attention to changes others might miss or dismiss." This was something Dr. Martinez had helped us both understand, that love could be a form of vigilance, that intimate partners often notice subtle changes that medical professionals might miss or dismiss. Victoria's manipulation was sophisticated enough to fool David and his previous boyfriends, but it wasn't subtle enough to escape the notice of someone who knew him deeply and observed him daily. "I keep thinking about James and Michael," I said, referring to Victoria's previous victims. "They didn't have anyone watching closely enough to notice what was happening to them. Or they had people watching who trusted Victoria's medical authority more than their own observations. That's the insidious thing about medical manipulation. It uses our cultural respect for doctors against us." My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed Dr. Washington's number, and I answered immediately. Over the past 6 weeks, she'd become not just an investigator, but something approaching a friend, someone who understood the complex dynamics of medical abuse cases.
"Elena, I wanted to update you on a development in your sister's case," Dr. Washington said without preamble. "We've been contacted by families from Boston, former patients from when Dr. Reyes was in residency there. It appears this pattern of behavior may go back much further than we initially realized." I felt my stomach drop. How much further? "Potentially years. We're working with Massachusetts authorities to investigate several suspicious cases. Patients who experienced unusual complications, families who felt their children were over-medicated or kept in the hospital longer than necessary. Nothing definitive yet, but enough to warrant a full investigation." The implications were staggering. If Victoria had been manipulating patients and families since her residency, the number of victims could be enormous. Children who'd been unnecessarily sedated, families who felt their healthy kids needed dangerous procedures, medical residents who'd been gaslighted into doubting their clinical judgment. What does this mean for her sentencing? If the Massachusetts investigation substantiates these allegations, the federal prosecutors may get involved. Medical fraud across state lines becomes a federal crime with much harsher penalties. After I hung up, I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process the possibility that Victoria's crimes were even more extensive than anyone had imagined. David watched me with concern, reading my expression accurately. "More victims?" he asked gently. "Potentially, going back to her residency in Boston." I felt tears gathering in my eyes, not for Victoria, but for all the people who might have suffered because I hadn't recognized the signs earlier. "David, what if I could have stopped this years ago? What if there were warning signs I missed?" David left his drafting table and settled beside me on the couch, pulling me into his arms with the easy affection that had slowly returned as he'd healed from Victoria's manipulation. "You can't blame yourself for not recognizing something you had no reason to suspect. Victoria fooled everyone, patients, families, colleagues, hospital administrators. She was brilliant at presenting herself as the perfect doctor, the perfect sister, the perfect person. But the signs were there. The defensiveness about work stress, the mood swings, the way she always had explanations for everything. Those signs could have indicated stress, burnout, or any number of normal responses to a demanding job. You're not a mind reader, Elena. You're a high school English teacher who trusted her sister and had no reason to suspect she was capable of systematic manipulation and fraud." Dr. Martinez had told us the same thing repeatedly, that victims and their families often blamed themselves for not recognizing abuse earlier, even when the perpetrator was skilled at concealment and manipulation. Victoria had spent years perfecting her ability to appear trustworthy and competent while conducting elaborate schemes of control and deception. "What helped you finally see through her?" David asked. I thought about the moment in Victoria's bathroom when the prescription bottle had fallen from her purse, about the gradual accumulation of observations that hadn't made sense individually, but formed a pattern when viewed together. "I think it was seeing how she talked about you versus how you actually were," I said slowly. "She kept describing symptoms and behaviors that didn't match what I observed. She'd say you were agitated, but you seemed calm. She'd describe obsessive behaviors, but what I saw was normal professional attention to detail. The disconnect between her medical narrative and my daily reality with you became impossible to ignore. So love made you a better detective than medical training made her a manipulator." It was a romantic way to frame it, but there was truth in David's observation. The intimate knowledge that came from sharing daily life with someone, seeing them in unguarded moments, noticing subtle changes in mood and behavior, understanding their natural rhythms and responses, could reveal inconsistencies that medical observation might miss. I also think her addiction was making her sloppy. Earlier victims might not have noticed the pill bottle because she was more careful about hiding her drug use. By the time she started targeting you, her need for medication was making her take bigger risks.
My parents called that evening, their voices heavy with exhaustion and grief. The preliminary hearing had been their first time seeing Victoria since her arrest, and the reality of orange jail scrubs and shackled hands had shattered any remaining hope that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. "We visited her after the hearing," my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She still insists she was helping David, that you misunderstood her treatment methods." This didn't surprise me. Victoria's psychological defense mechanisms were as sophisticated as her manipulation tactics. Rather than face the reality of what she'd done, she'd constructed an alternate narrative where she was the victim of a family conspiracy and David was an ungrateful patient who'd turned against her. "Has she mentioned addiction treatment?" I asked. "She says she doesn't have a drug problem," my father replied, his voice tight with frustration. claims the prescription bottles were for legitimate research into pain management protocols. Even now, even facing prison, she won't admit she needs help. Denial was common among medical professionals facing addiction and misconduct charges, according to Dr. Washington. Their professional identity was so closely tied to being healers and helpers that acknowledging harm done to patients threatened their fundamental sense of self. The judge ordered psychological evaluation as part of her sentencing, my mother continued. Maybe that will help her understand what she's done. Or maybe it would provide Victoria with new opportunities to manipulate mental health professionals, I thought, but didn't say. She'd spent years perfecting her ability to present herself as competent and trustworthy while concealing profound dysfunction. A court-ordered psychological evaluation would be just another performance for someone with her skills. "How are you two holding up?" I asked, genuinely concerned about my parents' well-being. "We're seeing a counselor," my father said, "someone who specializes in families affected by addiction and criminal behavior. It's helping us understand that Victoria's choices were hers alone, not something we caused or could have prevented." This was progress. In the immediate aftermath of Victoria's arrest, both my parents had cycled through elaborate theories about what they could have done differently, been more supportive of her career stress, noticed signs of addiction, intervened before her behavior escalated to criminal levels. The family counselor was helping them understand that Victoria's sophisticated manipulation had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of detection and intervention they blamed themselves for missing. "We love you, Elena," my mother said before we hung up. "What you did, reporting Victoria, protecting David, it took tremendous courage. We're proud of you." The words meant more to me than I'd expected. Throughout the investigation and legal proceedings, I'd worried that my parents would blame me for destroying Victoria's career and our family's reputation. Hearing that they recognized my actions as protective rather than vindictive helped heal some of the guilt I'd been carrying. After the call, David and I spent the evening planning our future in ways that had been impossible during the months of Victoria's manipulation. We talked about marriage, about buying a house, about the children we might have someday, and how we'd protect them from the kind of manipulation we'd experienced. "I want to do something with what happened to us," David said as we prepared for bed. "Not just recover from it, but use it to help